In the year 476, the unthinkable happened. Romulus Augustulus, a teenage emperor with a name that mockingly echoed Rome's legendary founder, was deposed by a Germanic warlord named Odoacer. The imperial regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the symbols of authority that had commanded the world for over a millennium, were packed into chests and sent eastward across the Mediterranean to Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire, the civilization that had built roads across 3 continents, codified law for posterity, and spread Latin language from Britain to North Africa, simply ceased to exist. Yet the Roman Empire did not fall in 476. While Western Europe descended into fragmentation, warlordism, and what later generations would call the Dark Ages, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, continued to thrive. From its glittering capital on the Bosphorus, Roman emperors still ruled, Roman laws still governed, and Roman legions still marched. For another 1,000 years this empire would endure, surviving Arab conquests, Slavic migrations, crusader betrayals, and plague outbreaks that killed millions. It would outlast Charlemagne's empire, the Abbasid Caliphate at its zenith, and the entire medieval period of Western European history. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the last Byzantine emperor died fighting on the walls, and the empire that had refused to acknowledge its own death finally, reluctantly, expired. How did this happen? How did the East survive when the West collapsed? The answer is not simple, nor is it reducible to geography or economics alone. The story of Byzantium's survival is a tale of political psychology, cultural metamorphosis, military brilliance, religious fervor, and the personalities of emperors who understood that survival required not just strength, but adaptation. It is the story of a civilization that learned to bend without breaking, to transform while insisting it never changed, to lose everything except the one thing that mattered, itself. This is the story of how Rome survived by ceasing to be Rome and yet remained Roman until its final breath.
Long before Odoacer sent the imperial regalia eastward, the Roman Empire's 2 halves had been diverging. The division was not sudden, nor was it initially intended to be permanent. Diocletian's administrative reforms in 284 had split the empire into eastern and western regions for practical governance, and Constantine's founding of Constantinople in 330 had created a new Rome that would rival the old. But beneath these administrative arrangements, deeper forces were already pulling East and West apart. The East was fundamentally wealthier. Egypt's grain fed Constantinople's multitudes. Anatolia's farms produced olives, wine, and textiles. Syria's cities hummed with commerce. The eastern provinces had been urbanized for centuries before Rome conquered them. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and dozens of other cities predated Roman rule and brought with them sophisticated economies, literate populations, and tax revenues that dwarfed anything the West could produce. When 4th century tax records are examined, the disparity is stark. The East generated roughly 2/3 of imperial revenue while containing only slightly more than half the population. This was not merely a matter of fertile river valleys. It was the accumulated wealth of civilizations that had prospered since the age of Alexander the Great. Culturally, the East had never fully Latinized. While the West spoke Latin, revered Roman legal traditions, and identified viscerally with the city of Rome itself, the eastern provinces remained fundamentally Greek. The language of administration, commerce, and culture was Greek. The philosophical traditions were Greek. The Christian theology being hammered out in fierce councils and street riots was articulated in Greek. The Eastern aristocracy could quote Homer as readily as Virgil, and often preferred the former. When Constantine built his new capital, he filled it with Greek-speaking administrators, Greek-educated bishops, and classical statuary looted from Greece itself. Constantinople was meant to be a new Rome, but it was a Rome reimagined through Hellenic eyes. This linguistic and cultural difference mattered profoundly when crises came. In the West, Germanic tribes had been filtering across the frontiers for centuries, serving in the army, settling on Roman land, and slowly, inexorably, becoming the dominant military class. By the 4th century, nearly all Western armies were commanded by Germanic generals, Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer, and increasingly composed of Germanic soldiers who owed loyalty to their tribal leaders rather than to distant emperors. The Western court became dependent on these warlords, unable to defend itself without them, unable to control them when they chose to act independently. The Roman state in the West hollowed out from within, maintaining the facade of imperial authority, while real power shifted to men who cared nothing for Roman law or Latin culture. The East faced similar pressures, but responded differently. Germanic tribes threatened the eastern frontiers as well. Goths, Vandals, and others probed for weakness. But Eastern emperors, commanding greater resources and operating from a more defensible geographical position, could afford to be strategic. Rather than becoming dependent on Germanic warlords, Eastern courts learned to manipulate them. When the Ostrogoths threatened Constantinople in the late 5th century, Emperor Zeno simply redirected them westward, commissioning their king Theodoric to reconquer Italy from Odoacer. The East thus eliminated two threats simultaneously, removing the Goths from its borders and destabilizing a rival warlord without fighting a single major battle. This was survival through cunning rather than strength, through diplomacy backed by gold rather than by legions. Gold mattered immensely. The Eastern Empire's wealth allowed it to pursue a foreign policy that the West could never afford, buying off enemies rather than fighting them. When Attila the Hun threatened Constantinople in the 440s, Emperor Theodosius II paid him off with massive tributes. Humiliating, expensive, but ultimately effective. The Huns ravaged the West instead, contributing to its destabilization while the East preserved its strength. Later Byzantine emperors would perfect this strategy, using gold, titles, marriage alliances, and shrewd diplomacy to turn enemies against each other, to delay invasions, to purchase temporary peace that could be leveraged into permanent security. But perhaps the most crucial foundation of Eastern survival was this: the East never lost its emperor. In the West, the 5th century saw a parade of weak, often puppet emperors manipulated by Germanic generals. Imperial authority became a fiction. The state's legitimacy evaporated. In the East, despite occasional palace coups and dynastic crises, the emperor office retained its sacred prestige. The emperor in Constantinople was not merely a political leader, but God's representative on earth, crowned in elaborate religious ceremonies, surrounded by ritual that emphasized his divine selection. This quasi-religious authority made the Eastern throne worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth obeying. When Western institutions crumbled, there was nothing to hold them together. When Eastern institutions were threatened, the emperor himself became the rallying point for resistance.
The century following Rome's fall was not a period of Eastern triumph. It was an age of desperate, grinding survival against enemies that should have destroyed Byzantium as they had destroyed the West. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Byzantium's ancient rival, launched repeated invasions throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. These were not border raids, but full-scale wars of conquest. Persian armies besieged cities, captured provinces, and challenged Byzantine control of the lucrative eastern trade routes. The wars drained imperial treasuries and decimated border populations. Yet Byzantium survived each conflict, adapting its military tactics, fortifying key strongholds, and always finding the resources to rebuild.
More dangerous still were the migrations. The Slavic peoples, moving southward from beyond the Danube, began settling in the Balkans in massive numbers during the 6th century. Unlike Germanic tribes that could be integrated or redirected, the Slavs came in waves so numerous that they fundamentally transformed the demographic character of the Balkan provinces. Byzantine control over these regions weakened, sometimes disappeared entirely. For a time, it seemed the empire might lose Europe entirely, retaining only its wealthy Asian provinces. And then came the plague. In 541, a pandemic now known as the Plague of Justinian erupted in Egypt and spread throughout the empire with horrifying speed. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen that would cause the Black Death 8 centuries later, killed indiscriminately. Contemporary sources describe bodies piled in the streets, mass graves unable to contain the dead, entire villages abandoned. The historian Procopius, usually measured in his accounts, wrote that at the height of the outbreak in Constantinople, 10,000 people were dying each day. Modern demographic analysis suggests the plague killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of the empire's population, a catastrophic loss from which full recovery took generations. The plague struck at the worst possible moment. It arrived during the reign of Justinian I, an emperor whose ambition was nothing less than the reconquest of the lost western provinces. And against all strategic logic, against every reasonable assessment of Byzantine capabilities, Justinian nearly succeeded. Justinian's reign represents both the zenith of Byzantine ambition and the clearest evidence of what separated East from West. Born a peasant in a Latin-speaking region of the Balkans, Justinian rose to power through his uncle, Emperor Justin I, and inherited the throne in 527 with a vision that seemed delusional. He would restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. He would reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and Spain from the Visigoths. He would rebuild Rome itself. He would codify Roman law for eternity. He would construct monuments that would dwarf anything built in centuries. And remarkably, he almost achieved it all. Justinian's general Belisarius was a military genius of the first order. With forces that were often outnumbered, operating thousands of miles from Constantinople, Belisarius conquered Vandal North Africa in a single campaign season in 533 to 534. The speed of the victory stunned contemporary observers. The Vandal kingdom, which had seemed permanent, collapsed in months. Byzantine rule was restored to Carthage, and the grain shipments from North Africa, so crucial to Rome's ancient prosperity, once again flowed eastward to Constantinople. Italy proved more difficult. The Gothic War, beginning in 535, dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Belisarius initially achieved stunning victories, capturing Rome itself in 536, but the Goths resisted fiercely under their king Totila, and the war degenerated into brutal sieges and scorched-earth campaigns that devastated the Italian peninsula. When Byzantine victory finally came in 554, Italy was a ruin. The population had been decimated by war, famine, and plague. The cities that had once been the jewels of Roman civilization were shadows of their former selves. Yet Justinian achieved his dream. By the time of his death in 565, Byzantine territory had nearly doubled. The Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. The empire stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia. It seemed as if the historical clock had been turned back, as if Rome itself had been restored.
It was an illusion. Justinian's conquests were not sustainable. The wars had exhausted the imperial treasury, the plague had devastated the population and the tax base. The Italian territories, far from being profitable additions, required constant military garrisons and administrative investment that they could no longer generate themselves. Within a generation of Justinian's death, much of what he had won would be lost again. But something far more important had been preserved: the state itself. Unlike the West, which had fragmented into competing Germanic kingdoms with no hope of reunification, the East had maintained institutional continuity. Justinian's codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe for centuries to come. His architectural achievements, particularly the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, stood as testaments to Byzantine cultural confidence. His administrative reforms streamlined imperial governance, making the state more efficient even as its territory contracted. Most critically, Justinian had demonstrated a principle that would define Byzantine survival for 1,000 years. The empire could lose territory without losing itself. Identity, legitimacy, and institutional integrity mattered more than geographical extent. Byzantium could contract to a fraction of its former size and still remain the Roman Empire as long as its emperor, its bureaucracy, its legal system, and its Christian faith remained intact.
The 7th century brought catastrophe so complete that it should have ended Byzantine history. Instead, it triggered the transformation that ensured survival. In 634, Arab armies erupted from the Arabian Peninsula, united by the new faith of Islam and led by commanders of extraordinary skill. Within a decade, they had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine Empire. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, fell in 637. Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, fell in 642. The Byzantine Empire lost 2/3 of its territory and 3/4 of its revenue in less than a generation. The speed and totality of the collapse shocked contemporaries. These provinces had been Roman for 7 centuries. They had survived Persian invasions, Germanic migrations, and plague outbreaks. Their loss seemed to herald the empire's end. Emperor Heraclius, who had just defeated the Persians in an exhausting 20-year war, reportedly considered abandoning Constantinople and retreating to Carthage. The empire seemed finished. But Byzantium did not fall. Instead, it transformed. The emperors of the 7th and 8th centuries, the Heraclian and Isaurian dynasties, presided over a revolutionary restructuring of the Byzantine state. What emerged was no longer the late Roman Empire that Justinian had ruled. It was something new, smaller, more militarized, more Greek, more explicitly Christian, and far more efficient. The most significant reform was the theme system. Faced with constant Arab raids and lacking the revenue to maintain traditional professional armies, Byzantine authorities reorganized Anatolia into military districts called themes. Each theme was governed by a strategos, general, who commanded both military and civil authority. Soldiers in each theme were settled on land with their families, creating a class of military farmers who could defend their homes without requiring full-time pay from the central government. This system made Byzantine defense sustainable, even with reduced tax revenues. It also created a resilient military structure where local commanders could respond immediately to threats without waiting for orders from Constantinople. The theme system worked. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab armies repeatedly invaded Anatolia, sometimes reaching the very walls of Constantinople, but they could never hold territory. Byzantine armies, drawn from the themes, would harass the invaders, cut their supply lines, and force retreats. The Arabs could win battles, but they could not win the war. Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantine power, remained unconquered. Culturally, the empire became definitively Greek. Latin, which had still been used in some official contexts in Justinian's time, disappeared from administration. Emperors stopped calling themselves Caesar or Augustus and adopted the Greek title Basileus. The bureaucracy, the army, the church all operated in Greek. This was not a rejection of Roman identity, but a redefinition of it. To be Roman in Byzantine understanding meant to be Christian, to be loyal to the emperor in Constantinople, and to participate in a civilization whose language was Greek, but whose legitimacy derived from unbroken continuity with ancient Rome. Religious identity became central to Byzantine survival in ways that had not been true in earlier centuries. The empire defined itself as the Christian empire, the defender of orthodoxy, the earthly manifestation of God's kingdom. When Arab armies swept through Syria and Egypt, Byzantine response was not just military, but theological. The losses were interpreted as divine punishment for incorrect belief, and emperors launched campaigns to enforce religious uniformity. This led to the iconoclasm controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries, a bitter decades-long conflict over whether religious images should be venerated or destroyed, that tore Byzantine society apart, but ultimately reinforced the Byzantine Christian identity. The controversy over icons reveals both Byzantine strength and weakness. The strength lay in the intensity of religious commitment. Byzantines cared so deeply about theological correctness that they would riot, launch civil wars, and endure persecution for their beliefs. This created a society with profound internal cohesion based on shared faith. The weakness was that religious disputes could become existential threats, dividing the empire precisely when unity was most needed. But through all these transformations, military, cultural, religious, one element remained constant: the bureaucracy. Byzantine administration, inherited from late Roman traditions but refined over centuries, became legendary for its sophistication. The empire maintained detailed tax registers, provincial archives, and diplomatic records. It operated a postal system that allowed messages to travel from Constantinople to distant frontiers in days. It trained professional administrators who could govern provinces, negotiate treaties, and manage complex financial operations. This bureaucratic continuity meant that even when emperors were weak or crises severe, the state machinery continued functioning. Taxes were collected, soldiers were paid, and the empire endured.
By the 9th century, Byzantium had not merely survived, it had begun to thrive. The empire that had seemed on the brink of extinction 2 centuries earlier now entered a period of cultural and military resurgence that would last for 2 centuries and mark the medieval height of Byzantine power. The Macedonian dynasty, ruling from 867 to 1056, presided over this golden age. Emperor Basil I, founder of the dynasty, was himself a remarkable figure. Born a peasant, he rose through military service and palace intrigue to seize the throne through murder. Yet he proved an effective ruler, stabilizing imperial finances, strengthening the military, and launching campaigns that began recovering territory lost to the Arabs. His successors continued the expansion. Byzantine armies reconquered Crete, Cyprus, and parts of Syria. The empire's borders expanded for the first time in centuries. But more impressive than territorial recovery was cultural resurgence. Byzantine art, literature, and scholarship flourished. The university in Constantinople became the premier center of learning in Christendom. Byzantine missionaries spread Orthodox Christianity to the Slavic peoples, creating lasting cultural bonds that would influence Eastern European history for a millennium. The reign of Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, epitomized Byzantine power at its height. Ruling from 976 to 1025, Basil crushed the Bulgarian Empire in decades of brutal warfare, personally leading campaigns and demonstrating a ruthlessness that shocked even his contemporaries.
After his final victory in 1018, he allegedly blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one eye to every 100th man so they could lead their comrades home. The story may be exaggerated, but it reflects Basil's reputation. He was merciless, efficient, and utterly effective. Under Basil II, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest medieval extent. The Balkans were firmly under imperial control. Anatolia was secure. Imperial prestige was unmatched. The empire's gold coin, the nonisma, was accepted currency from Britain to India. Byzantine silk, art, and culture were coveted throughout the known world. Constantinople, with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, was the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in Christendom. Yet even at this height, the seeds of future crisis were visible. The military aristocracy in Anatolia was growing increasingly powerful and increasingly independent. These were families who had commanded themes for generations, who owned vast estates, and who regarded themselves as the true defenders of the empire. They chafed under the control of bureaucrats in Constantinople and resented emperors who tried to limit their power. Basil II spent much of his reign suppressing aristocratic revolts, understanding that unchecked military elites could tear the empire apart. The Church, too, was becoming a source of division. In 1054, disputes between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Rome over theological issues and ecclesiastical jurisdiction led to mutual excommunication, the Great Schism, that formally divided Eastern Orthodoxy from Roman Catholicism. The split had been developing for centuries, rooted in linguistic, cultural, and theological differences, but its formal manifestation created a lasting rupture that would have profound strategic consequences, particularly when Western Crusaders later arrived in Byzantine territory, regarding the Greeks not as fellow Christians but as schismatics. Still, the Macedonian period demonstrated that Byzantium possessed extraordinary resilience. The empire had recovered from near death, had adapted to new realities, and had found ways to prosper even in a much diminished form. The key to this success was psychological as much as material. Byzantines never accepted that they were anything other than Romans, never acknowledged that their empire was a shadow of its former self, never stopped believing that they represented legitimate imperial authority. This confidence, sometimes delusional but always powerful, sustained the state through centuries when objective conditions suggested it should collapse.
The 11th century marked the beginning of the end, though contemporaries could not have known it. The empire's decline was neither immediate nor linear. There would be periods of recovery, moments of brilliance, and emperors who seemed to reverse the tide. But the fundamental trajectory was downward, driven by internal decay and external pressures that even Byzantine ingenuity could not overcome. The crisis began with military disaster. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos IV was destroyed by Seljuk Turkish forces. The emperor himself was captured, an unprecedented humiliation. The defeat was catastrophic not because of casualties alone, but because it shattered Byzantine military prestige and exposed Anatolia, the empire's heartland, to Turkish invasion. Within a decade, Turkish tribes had occupied most of central Anatolia. The theme system, which had defended the region for centuries, collapsed. Military farmers abandoned their lands or were killed. Provincial administration disintegrated. The empire lost not just territory, but the foundation of its military strength. Anatolia, which had provided the soldiers and tax revenue that sustained Byzantine power, was gone. The Komnenian dynasty, ruling from 1081 to 1185, attempted to stabilize the situation through military skill and diplomatic cunning.
Alexios I Komnenos, who seized power in 1081, was a brilliant strategist who managed to preserve Constantinople and maintain some imperial authority despite catastrophic territorial losses. He used diplomacy with ruthless efficiency, playing Turkish factions against each other, manipulating Western crusaders, and extracting maximum advantage from minimal resources. The arrival of the First Crusade in 1099 to 1101 presented both opportunity and danger. Western knights, responding to Byzantine appeals for military aid, swept through Anatolia and conquered Jerusalem. But their presence created new problems. The Crusaders established their own states in Syria and Palestine, competing with Byzantine interests. Cultural and religious tensions between Latin Crusaders and Greek Byzantines erupted repeatedly into violence. The Byzantines, masters of diplomacy, found the Crusaders crude, aggressive, and dangerously unpredictable. The Crusaders found the Byzantines effete, untrustworthy, and insufficiently committed to holy war. These tensions culminated in catastrophe in 1204. The Fourth Crusade, originally intended to recapture Jerusalem, was diverted by Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine dynastic intrigue. Rather than fighting Muslims, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople itself. The city fell on April 13, 1204, and for 3 days Western soldiers pillaged the richest city in Christendom. Churches were desecrated, libraries burned, irreplaceable works of art destroyed or stolen. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople, and the Byzantine state, which had survived for 9 centuries, temporarily ceased to exist. Yet even this did not end Byzantine history. Byzantine aristocrats established successor states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus, each claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. The Empire of Nicaea, the strongest of these states, gradually rebuilt Byzantine power. In 1261, Emperor Mikhail Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople and restored Byzantine rule.
But the restored empire was a pale shadow of what had existed before. Constantinople had been ravaged, the provinces were lost or reduced, the economy was shattered. The empire controlled only fragments of its former territory. Constantinople and its immediate hinterland, parts of Greece, and scattered outposts elsewhere. It was surrounded by powerful enemies, the Ottoman Turks in Anatolia, Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms in the Balkans, and Latin states that still coveted Byzantine territory. The final 2 centuries of Byzantine history were an agonizing, slow-motion collapse. The empire survived through diplomacy, careful management of limited resources, and occasional military victories that delayed the inevitable. The Palaiologian dynasty produced several capable emperors who fought desperately to preserve what remained, but the trajectory was irreversible. The Ottoman Turks, emerging as the dominant power in Anatolia in the 14th century, gradually encircled Constantinople. They conquered Byzantine territories piece by piece: Bithynia, Thrace, the Balkans. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered holdings. The city was an island of Christianity in an Ottoman sea, surviving only because the sultans had not yet decided to pay the price of conquest.
Constantinople had withstood sieges before, by Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Russians, always surviving through its massive defensive walls, its strategic position, and the determination of its defenders. But the siege that began on April 6, 1453, was different. Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old and burning with ambition, commanded an army of perhaps 80,000 soldiers and the most advanced artillery in the world. Massive cannons, designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, could hurl stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds against Constantinople's ancient walls.
Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos commanded a garrison of perhaps 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Italians, and a handful of foreign volunteers. The disparity was overwhelming. Constantine knew the city could not be held indefinitely, but surrender was unthinkable. He was Roman emperor, descendant of Augustus and Constantine the Great. While he lived, the Roman Empire lived. For 7 weeks, the Ottomans battered the walls with artillery fire. The defenders repaired the breaches each night, fighting exhaustion and dwindling supplies. The city's ancient fortifications, built by Theodosius II 1,000 years earlier, absorbed punishment that no medieval wall should have withstood. But the cannons were relentless, and Constantinople's garrison was simply too small to defend 13 miles of walls against an enemy willing to accept massive casualties. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final assault. Ottoman soldiers poured through breached sections of the wall. Fighting raged through the streets. Constantine XI, recognizing that the end had come, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. His body was never definitively identified, but he died somewhere in the chaos, sword in hand, fighting for a city and an empire that had already ceased to exist. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. The city that had been Christian for over 1,000 years was now Ottoman. The empire that had bridged the ancient and medieval worlds, that had preserved Greek and Roman learning through centuries of chaos, that had claimed unbroken continuity with the Caesars, was finally, irrevocably gone. The Byzantine Empire's 1,000-year survival after the fall of Rome was not an accident of geography or economics, though both mattered. It was the product of relentless adaptation, cultural confidence, military innovation, bureaucratic sophistication, and the determination of generations of emperors and soldiers who believed, even when circumstances suggested otherwise, that they were preserving civilization itself. Byzantium survived because it learned to bend. When it lost the West, it did not collapse, but redefined itself as a Greek Christian empire. When it lost Egypt and Syria, it restructured its military to defend what remained. When it lost most of Anatolia, it found ways to survive on the fragments. The empire's great strength was its ability to transform while maintaining institutional and psychological continuity. Byzantines in the 15th century still called themselves Romans, still saw Constantinople as the capital of the Roman Empire, still believed they represented the legitimate heir of Augustus. This was not delusion, but a kind of civilizational faith that sustained the state through catastrophes that would have destroyed any normal kingdom. The West collapsed because it could not adapt. When Germanic warlords seized power, Western imperial authority evaporated because it had no deep roots beyond military force and legal tradition. When those failed, there was nothing left. The East survived because imperial authority was sacralized, because the bureaucracy functioned independently of individual rulers, because cultural identity was strong enough to withstand territorial loss. Modern historians often dismiss Byzantium as a corrupt, static, declining remnant of classical Greekness, a civilization that survived long past its expiration date. This view is profoundly mistaken. Byzantium was dynamic, innovative, and culturally vibrant for most of its history. It preserved and transmitted the learning of the ancient world when Western Europe had forgotten how to read Greek. It developed sophisticated administrative techniques that influenced European statecraft for centuries. It produced art and architecture that still inspire awe. It demonstrated that empires need not expand to survive, that identity and legitimacy can sustain a state even in material decline. The empire's final lesson is perhaps the most important. Civilizations die not when they lose territory or wealth, but when they lose faith in themselves. Byzantium believed itself Roman until the very end. That belief, maintained across 1,000 years of crisis, transformation, and slow decline, was ultimately what allowed it to survive so long after its Western twin had perished. When Constantine XI died fighting on the walls of Constantinople, he died as Roman emperors were supposed to die, defending the state with his life. In that moment, the empire that had refused to die finally ended, not with a whimper of surrender, but with the defiant roar of a civilization that never, even in its final breath, accepted defeat. The Byzantine story is not one of inevitable decline, but of resilient adaptation. It teaches us that survival requires not just strength, but flexibility, not just military power, but cultural cohesion, not just wealth, but institutional sophistication. Byzantium lived for 1,000 years after Rome fell, because it understood that empires, like all living things, must change to survive, but that change need not mean the loss of identity. The Eastern Roman Empire transformed itself repeatedly, each time emerging as something new, yet insisting it had always been the same. In that paradox lies the secret of its extraordinary longevity and the reason its history still echoes across the centuries, a testament to the power of adaptation, the strength of belief, and the resilience of civilizations that refuse to die.